Tricks. Here's your long lesson. So I do recognize that I've been doing a lot of like little bits and pieces, but it was just to build you up to this point here. Okay. So we've got 24 slides to go through, and let's see how it goes. All right, so previously I spoke about homeostasis, and I said to you homeo meaning same and stasis meaning state. So it's the idea that the body wants to keep itself in the same state absolutely constantly, like regardless of what happens around it. And this is the definition itself: the process of maintaining the internal environment in a constant optimal state despite constant changes in the external environment. So some sort of change could be you eating, the weather changing, it could be temperature changing, it could be the amount of water in your system. There really are like a lot of bits and pieces that ultimately will change how the external like part of this works, and then how your body responds in a either positive or negative way. Now, I'm not saying positive as in like, oh, it's good, or negative, oh, it's bad. I'm saying like positive as in like it's going to push the body further in one direction, or negative, it's going to try and bring it back to where it originally was. So things in the body that need to be kept constant, such as temperature, oxygen, and carbon dioxide levels. And I recommend you go back into your grade 11 notes where we did the regulation of the amount of carbon dioxide in the system and how that increases the heart rate. And that was all based on the pH. So the more carbon dioxide, the more then there's carbonic acid, which caused the heart rate to increase, and that got more carbon dioxide out, which meant the pH dropped, so on and so forth. So if you want to go have a look at that, that'll be a good example for you guys now. Then the salt and water concentrations, pH of blood, which we spoke about earlier, and the blood glucose level. So blood glucose levels is the biggest one of the, well, there's two main things. So it's the production of gametes and the blood glucose level, and that will be done in the next lesson. So first and foremost, if I can just go to the next slide. No. Oh, very good. All right, cool. So this is the general functioning of a feedback mechanism showing positive and negative feedbacks. So on the far left hand side, and please note this isn't cyclic, it's not a circle, it's from one side to the other side. So from the correct level, which is the normal level, to a correct level, which is the normal level on the other side as well. So we're going to deal with the top half, and then we'll deal with the bottom half. So if you are at the correct level and then you have an excess of something, so let's say for instance you have too much carbon dioxide in your system, there will be some sort of correction mechanism. This correction mechanism will involve like a whole bunch of different bits and pieces. So there'll be a receptor involved, there'll be hormones involved, there'll be actual organs involved. So that corrective mechanism is quite a loaded little part over there. From the correction mechanism, there'll be a negative feedback, which means we're going the opposite direction of where we were. So from excess, we're going to a deficiency. But the deficiency is not going to lead us to go below the normal, it's just leading us back to the normal. As well as from the bottom perspective, where the correct level, the normal, we then have a deficiency of something. So let's say you don't have enough sugar in your system, or maybe your body's too cold, so there's not enough heat. You'll have some sort of correction mechanism. So let's say, for instance, you're too cold, you'll start shivering, and then that will heat you up, and then there'll be a negative feedback system where your body reaches its correct temperature and will go back to its normal level again. So you can imagine to a large extent that if this is where your normal is, like there's a line, and the excess and deficiency is going to go above and below that constantly. And this is really important because something like your body temperature needs to be kept normal constantly as well. And that needs to be kept at 37 degrees, or between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. So, you know, it will fluctuate around there, but it will be as close to a equilibrium as humanly possible. On the odd occasion, however, we can have a positive feedback system. So let's say on the left hand side you have a correct normal level, and then you have an excess of something. Then that excess, you want more of that excess because the body has not completed a particular job. So then you want a positive feedback system where that excess is causing further excess. So there'll be a whole mechanism in between that line over there, which is indicating to the body that because this excess is occurring, now we want further of that. The same with the deficiency at the bottom. So we have the correct normal level, and then at the bottom we have a deficiency mechanism. So we need to drop something for the body to do something, and then we need to drop it even further. But the initial deficiency caused the further deficiency of whatever's happening. Sorry about that, ladies. My computer just kind of gave up for a bit over there. So I do recognize this isn't easy, but just rewatch that slide. I'm going to have multiple slides doing exactly that. So if you didn't catch it the first time, I'll be able to do it a couple of times again with you. So the one way to maintain homeostasis is by the use of a negative feedback mechanism, negative feedback loop, just negative feedback system. It's up to you what you feel like calling it, but as long as you understand it's a negative feedback. So something has happened, that something is wrong, we need to go back to the original state, but there's a whole bunch of control mechanisms in between all of that. So the principle of negative feedback goes as such. Any deviation from the normal state is corrected by causing a change to occur in the opposite direction so that the deviation is cancelled. So something changed, this caused a change to occur. We now want to go back to the original part, and there is a mechanism in between of that. So just directly relating it back there. So now you can see that the deviation has occurred, which is the excess or deficiency. It is then corrected by a correction mechanism. This is happening, well, this creates a change in the negative direction, which means that we're going from excess back to normal or deficiency back to normal. Just so that you guys understand, and the excess or deficiency then is cancelled to a large extent. So the principle of negative feedback is when some condition in the body changes, mechanisms in the body produce the opposite effect, so the body returns to normal. And if this isn't making much sense now, you'll see. So the idea over here is that there is some sort of stimulus. Now remember, a stimulus is something that causes a change in the body. So we have a stimulus right at the top in the first green block, and then it somehow affects an endocrine cell. So that stimulus could be increased temperature, increased water, increased pH, increased oxygen, decreased oxygen, a whole bunch of different things. That is going to cause an endocrine cell to respond in a very specific manner. That endocrine cell is producing hormones from its cell itself, and that is moving directly into a blood vessel. Remember that an endocrine system is, we move our hormones or messengers via the blood vessels. Once the blood is moved around, it's going to hit a specific target cell. That target cell is then going to do its job. So the hormones that were released by the endocrine cell are saying to the target cells, you now need to produce something else because you have done what you needed to do. All right. Once that happens, there is some sort of response. That response is going to then reduce the amount of stimulus, or it's going to increase that stimulus. So please don't think that it's like it's always just going less. Sometimes it is increased. So if there's too much of something, I will then need to cause a deficiency or need to cause it to drop. So let's say you have too much glucose in your system, your body is now going to drop the amount of glucose by converting it into glycogen. But if there is not enough glucose, it's then going to cause the system to convert glycogen back into glucose. So the stimulus in this particular instance, let's say keeping with the glucose vibe, is either too much glucose or too little glucose. That is going to affect the pancreas. The pancreas is going to release stuff in the blood vessels. Those blood vessels are going to go to the liver and all the muscles. That is then going to either increase the amount of glucose or glycogen, and that is going to cause the stimulus again, which is then going to affect the endocrine cells, telling it to either stop producing insulin or glucagon. The general functioning of a feedback system showing positive and negative feedback. So again, we have the correct level. We then have an excess or deficiency. Then we have, if this wasn't positive feedback, so we wanted more excess or more deficiency, we would have further excess or further deficiency. Alternatively, there is some sort of corrective mechanism, which is the use by the target target organs, which are then releasing very specific molecules or hormones that are causing it to change in very specific ways. This is going to lead to a negative feedback system, which is going to try and get it back as perfectly as possible back to the correct level. So again, notice this isn't a circle, it's just one particular way. Either there is a deficiency or there is an excess or something. Same again, but now we have maybe a slightly more complex version of this. So by number one, it says there's a stimulus. This produces change in some sort of variable. Again, that could be temperature, oxygen, carbon dioxide, pH, amount of water, amount of salt, that kind of stuff. The change is detected by a receptor. So the receptor could ultimately be your pituitary gland. It could also be your liver. It could be your pancreas. It could be your hypothalamus. It could be a whole bunch of different things. So the receptor acts as the sensor. Once this happens, there's an input. So the information is sent along an afferent pathway to the control center. The control center in this instance, and more often than not, will have to be your pituitary gland and or the hypothalamus. Then there is an output information sent. The control center could also just be a normal organ as well, but to a large extent it's your pituitary or hypothalamus, because that needs to decide what is going to happen. The information is sent along the efferent pathway, so outwards, so afferent into, efferent outwards, to an effector organ or some sort of effector thing, which is going to make a decision about what's going on. So the response of the effector feeds back to the influence magnitude of the stimulus and returns variable to homeostasis. So it's just the fact that we're taking a variable, which is homeostasis, and we are turning it into an imbalance, that imbalance either being the deficiency or the excess. A receptor is picking this up. The control center is deciding what to do. The effector organ is affecting it correctly. And then boom, we're going back to homeostasis as best as possible. This is not always going to happen, believe me. Then, if we have a positive feedback system and you guys are a bit confused about the difference, here's a good example. So if we have cattle running and cattle start running all over the place, that's going to cause panic. But panic is going to cause more cattle running, and more cattle running is going to cause more panic, and so on and so forth. As one increases, so the other increases. So this is an excess, which leads to a further excess, which leads to a further excess, which leads to a further excess. Another good example, and is used often in textbooks, is the idea of giving birth. So during contractions, while the baby is actually being moved out of the vaginal canal, the amount of pressure that is pushed on the cervix and the vaginal walls is increased. As the pressure increases, so the body is stimulated to produce more and more and more and more and more contractions. And this is further going to push the baby from the top out through until birth is actually given. So once the baby has now left the vaginal canal and has passed through the cervix, there's no more pressure, which causes your contractions to completely stop. Well, this is what should happen. So that would be a deficiency, which leads to a further deficiency. So again, while you are giving birth, the baby's pressure of its head on the vaginal canal as well as the cervix causes the body to go through further contractions, and the more it is forced out, the more contractions happen. And once the baby has been pushed out completely, the body recognizes there's no more pressure, and when there's no more pressure, it will then reduce the amount of contractions. And this is hoping that you have natural birth. And remember, you're still going to push out your placenta at the end of it. So we're just going to quickly remind you about the hypothalamus and where it is, and also the place of the pituitary, or also otherwise known as the hypophysis. So the hypophysis produces antidiuretic hormone, which we've mentioned already, deals with the amount of salt and water, and that has to do with the kidneys. And then oxytocin, which is the love hormone, as well as which decides about your contractions. So these hormones are stored and released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So as much as it is produced in the hypothalamus, it's not stored there. It is stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, so that it can be released whenever something goes wrong. So there's some sort of deviation from the normal. The pituitary gland secretes growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, sex hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. And the pituitary gland stores and releases antidiuretic hormone. So we're specifically going to just focus on the growth hormone, because I feel like this is maybe a bit more important. So it promotes growth of the skeleton and muscles. What you've noticed over there, they've also included adipose tissue and the liver has a direct impact on the bone structure, because it also helps with the release of calcium. So without growth hormone, and before I go on to explaining, you guys can already recognize that the body is going to not grow to a large extent. So a lot of things are going to be completely underdeveloped. But depending on whether your body produced too much or too little when you were a kid or an adult, is completely different. So a lot of the time, your growth hormone is genetic, and well, like it will be released genetically via the hypothalamus. And if there is a problem from birth, you're then either going to become a giant or a dwarf. Whereas if you're an adult and then your growth hormone starts increasing rapidly, you're going to find that only certain parts of the body are going to grow and increase in size, whereas the rest of it is actually just going to stay the same. So on the far left-hand side over there, you have something called acromegaly. So this is, you can see from this person's feet, their feet are absolutely huge. They're bulbous to a large extent. They really look puffy. They don't actually look like normal functioning feet, even though they are. But when you also are an adult, you have a large jaw. Your cheekbones and eyebrow ridges really start protruding. So this whole chunk moves forward. Just above your cheeks and just above your eyes also start pushing forward. You also end up with a more like oval looking face. And this is when you are an adult and then your body starts producing too much growth hormone. If you release too much growth hormone when you are a baby, you are going to experience giantism. So we can also call this a pituitary giant. It's a nice way of explaining it, and also helps your marker later on in life. So this is when you have too much from childhood. We then have correct or normal, as you will. And sure, normal obviously fluctuates quite rapidly, and this is majority just for men. But to a large extent, there is quite a lot of variation, but not as much as the outliers of being too big or being too small. And finally, you can see in the bottom right corner over there, if you have too little growth hormone when you are born, you're going to be called a pituitary dwarf, or you're going to experience pituitary dwarfism. So let's have a look at what these people actually look like. So if you have oversecretion, you become a pituitary giant. This is some sort of Asian woman, and you can see that she is astronomically tall. The problem with these people also is that their heart cannot grow big enough and pump fast enough to allow for enough blood to like move through the entire body. On top of it, their bones grow far too quickly, which means that their bones are going to be extremely brittle, and by later ages, if they do not get proper calcium supplements, they will die at a very young age. I can't remember the average age of person who suffers from being a pituitary giant, but I know it is not very late. I think it might be up into like the age of 50 or something. On the other hand, you can be well, here's a pituitary giant and a pituitary dwarf. I mean, look how small that person is. It's no bigger than a Guinness World Book of Records, and a Guinness World Book of Records is barely 30 centimeters tall. I mean, these people are astronomically small. So when I say normal, I really mean the woman in blue, and when I say too little, I'm talking about the person in blue, and when I say too much, I'm talking about the person in maroon. So you can really see there's huge outliers. This is the smallest woman in the world. She is Indian, and she is no taller than that little child over there. And what that child is probably about, I don't know, 2 years old-ish, maybe 1.5, 2 years old. And she's absolutely tiny. I actually don't know if she is still alive, and I'm assuming she is. I did see her on a show on TV, but I mean, you never know with reruns nowadays. So she is absolutely miniature, and you can see that her body has tried to keep her like into proportion, and pituitary dwarfs generally are in proportion, whereas like you get other types of dwarfs where certain parts of their body grow properly, whereas other parts just don't grow within proportion of themselves. So acromegaly is the oversecretion of growth hormone in adults. You can see from this man, look at his brow ridges and look at his cheeks. You can see that they've overextended and they've pushed quite far out. His brow ridges are really going over his eyes. He actually looks a bit like underdeveloped in terms of evolution. His skull is just that far forward. And look at his chin. His chin has been pulled so far forward. And then these are feet from someone who suffers from acromegaly as well. So you can see that the toes are elongated, the actual foot bones, so like the tarsals are pushed way out, and it really becomes quite deformed. So you can imagine people start looking like they need to wear clown shoes, but it's actually quite a problem for them because it's not like they asked for this. Sure, there are ways that you can try and reduce the amount of growth hormone that is in the system, but those therapies are actually quite expensive. So the bones of the hand and the feet, or bones of hands, feet, and face become enlarged, and especially the chin. You can really see that flat chin over there. And no, he's not becoming a celebrity. You can't cut glass with that. All right, so let's talk about gonadal hormones. These are coming from your ovaries and testicles. well, not your testicles, but a man's. So we have oestrogen. I recommend you just call it estrogen, but you spell it with an O. I've also seen in some textbooks that they also just spell it with an E. So it is completely up to you as to how you feel like pronouncing these things or spelling these things. So they're responsible for the secondary female characteristics. So let's go back to life orientation. Remember that your secondary sexual characteristics are a large thighs. It is an hourglass figure. It is the production of boobs like your ovaries that start growing and all those other sexual reproductive organs. So there we go, stimulate development of the female sex organs. And also, please understand that at some point while you are developing within your mother, that you had both reproductive systems for man and female. So you actually had tubes, a set of tubes going from like a general area and then when you were developing, there was either an increase in estrogen or an increase in testosterone, which caused the body to ultimately choose whether it was going to be a male or female based on the genetics and the amount of estrogen, testosterone that is being produced by the baby themselves. So it's responsible for the thickening of the endometrium. So the endometrium is something we'll come across later, but it's actually what you guys commonly known as period. So this is the lining of blood and nutrients that form part on the inside of the uterus that allow for the implantation of babies, the developing zygotes to sit in. It also suppresses the release of the female hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. Now I mentioned follicle stimulating hormone to you in the last lesson. And I said to you, this is something that is going to produce a cell, and inside of that cell, you will produce the egg. So now, if I have too much estrogen in my system, you can fully understand that my body is just not going to produce follicle stimulating hormone. If I don't produce follicle stimulating hormone, that means that I will never go through the process of producing an egg. And if I can't produce an egg, I can't go through the process of ovulation. If I have no ovulation, that means I'm going to become infertile. In the same way, so we have estrogen and then we have progesterone, and this is responsible for the further thickening of endometrium as well as the maintenance thereof during pregnancy. So a lot of women actually do lose their babies because of this lack of progesterone. And what should happen is the baby's placenta actually starts producing this progesterone, and then after a certain while your body should start producing the progesterone so the baby can focus on developing itself. And that swap over between the baby or the placenta producing and you producing sometimes doesn't happen, and that can cause the baby to stop developing completely. So let's start talking about the male testicles. So we're going to have testosterone, responsible for secondary male characteristics, deeper voice, facial hair, greater muscle mass, Adam's apple, all those other kinds of bits and pieces. Plays a role in the development of male sex organs during puberty, necessary for maturation of sperm cells. And then let's talk about infertility. So this lesson isn't going to be as long as you wanted it, but it should get a bit pear-shaped now. So I want you to pay careful attention. Infertility is extremely important. And by definition, it's the inability of a couple to conceive after not using contraceptives for at least 1 year. So you need to make sure that you remember the fact that after 1 year of using contraceptives, because a lot of the time female contraceptives can actually cause lasting damage and sometimes up to 3 years, and that's what leads to infertility. So if the pituitary gland fails to secrete FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, ovulation will not occur. If testosterone is not secreted, sperm cells will not develop. All right, sorry ladies, I messed up over there, so I'm just going to try and do the slide again. All right, so this is your first negative feedback system that I need you guys to know. And this negative feedback system is how infertility affects human beings. So this was actually a question in, what is that? Was last year's exam as well as the year before that, where they asked for you guys to explain how infertility can occur and if too many, or if drugs were taken, how this would affect everything. So from the hypothalamus releases the GnRH, which is like something that releases like gonadal hormones. This positively stimulates the anterior pituitary gland. This anterior pituitary gland, or the pituitary gland or hypophysis, then releases luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone. So a quick refresher, follicle stimulating hormone is the hormone that is produced so that we can start creating gametes, and luteinizing hormone is the hormone that is used once the follicle has developed completely to cause ovulation or release of the sperm. This LH and FSH is then sent to the male testicles and the female ovaries. Remember that these things are the gonads. The male testicles and the female ovaries will then produce specific hormones. These sex hormones known as testosterone, estradiol or estrogen, and progesterone. This testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone actually cause the inhibition, or it inhibits the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. So now, let's say you drink out of plastic bottles your entire existence, just plastic bottles. You leave them in the sun, and that causes the production of pseudoestrogens in the water bottle from the plastic actually breaking down itself. If you are a female and your body recognizes that if it increases the amount of estrogen in the system, that it is then going to cause the inhibition of the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, that means that if those two things keep on being inhibited, no GnRH will be produced and no LH and FSH. If those two particular hormones are inhibited and they are never produced, the body will never go through the process of ovulation at all. It just won't happen. The same in males. So if the testosterone, so let's say you are a man is a bodybuilder and he takes excessive amounts of testosterone. I'm talking like pumps himself full every day so that he can grow big muscles and look beautiful for who knows what. His body, all that excess testosterone, will keep on inhibiting the hypothalamus from producing GnRH, and it will inhibit the anterior pituitary gland to produce LH and FSH. If we are not going to be able to have LH and FSH, and we're not going to be producing sperm and eggs, that means that we are ultimately going to experience infertility. So to a large extent, your diet has a lot of these fake hormones inside of them, which could ultimately create you to becoming completely infertile. So this is slightly more basic version. Let's look at a slightly more complex, and I focused on male sterility as well, or male infertility, just because it comes up more often. It's not a misogynistic way or anything. So let's start from the top. The stimuli from areas in the brain, the hypothalamus specifically. The hypothalamus is going to release that GnRH, which is then going to go through the anterior pituitary gland. From that, two different hormones are being produced, FSH and LH. So FSH is going to go to the Sertoli cells, which is then going to force it to produce more cells themselves, more sperm cells. Whereas the luteinizing hormone is going to affect the Leydig cells and make more testosterone. So the Sertoli cells are making the sperm itself. It's going through the spermatogenesis, which means the making of sperm. And the Leydig cells are making testosterone. And this is because the body cannot continuously produce sperm if it's not necessary. So ultimately, within the testicles themselves, the Leydig cells are going to produce testosterone, which is going to create a negative feedback system on the anterior pituitary as well as the hypothalamus, causing the inhibition of those particular glands, and those glands will then stop producing GnRH as well as FSH, so and luteinizing hormone. So you can see here that if the body produced too many sperm cells, eventually the testicles would become extremely sore. So the body needs to stop that process by producing testosterone, and that inhibits the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. When it inhibits it, it's going to reduce the amount of those hormones, which means it reduces the amount of sperm, bringing the amount of sperm to an average normal level. And then whenever the sperm is used up, or maybe it is used or it just gets old and the body breaks it down, the hypothalamus will then be stimulated to produce more GnRH, more FSH, more LH, and you'll produce more sperm cells until there are enough, and then the testosterone will cause it to cancel again. Alright, so I hope that this helps you, and that was your first negative feedback system. In the next lesson, we're going to be doing the pancreas and how the pancreas works. Alright, have a great day, ladies.